The night I met my husband, he held a sword to my chest. His grip was steady, his eyes cold like a man born to kill. But what he didn't know was that he already had. In another life. I should have run. I should have screamed. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, because the moment I looked into his eyes, the memories came rushing back, flashes of a life long gone. A life where I had loved him, trusted him, and in the end, died at his hands. Now, fate has twisted our paths once again. In this life, I wear his ring. I bear his name. But I can't escape the truth. My husband was my executioner in my past life. And if history dares to repeat itself, this time, I won't go down without a fight. Hey you! Welcome to Cupidoops, where love and logic are officially divorced, and chaos has full custody. Chaos begins. I was the Empress of the Moon Empire but was killed by my beloved, and when I thought my life had ended. Darkness. After darkness, I woke up to a world of silk and quiet whispers. Gone was the smell of blood and fire. Gone was the weight of a sword in my hands. Instead, I woke up as Bai Shui, the eldest daughter of the Bai family, a noble household in the Empire of Liang. I should have been grateful. I was alive. I had a mother who fussed over me, sisters who giggled about love, and a father who cared about honor and duty more than affection. A proper life. A safe life. But something was missing. Some nights, I dreamed of a battlefield beneath a blood-red moon. Of a man with golden eyes whispering my name. Of betrayal, fire, and pain so deep it swallowed me whole. And every morning, I woke up feeling hollow. Like I had lost someone and forgotten how to grieve. The day the imperial decree arrived, I was sipping tea in the garden. The sun was warm, the air fragrant with jasmine, and for once, my world felt calm. Then a servant rushed in, breathless. "My lady, your father summons you. It is urgent." I barely had time to stand before I was being ushered into the main hall. My father stood before me, a golden scroll in his hands. My mother knelt beside him, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "Bai Shui," my father said, voice heavy with importance. "You have been granted the greatest honor." I frowned. What honor? He unrolled the scroll and read aloud. "By the decree of His Majesty, the Emperor of Liang, Lady Bai Shui shall be wed to General Li Weiran, hero of the Empire, defender of the North. The wedding shall take place within 1 month." The room spun. Marriage? To General Li Weiran? I opened my mouth, but no words came. I knew the name. Everyone knew the name. He was the Empire's most powerful general. A man of war, undefeated, feared on the battlefield. I had never met him. Never even seen him. But the moment I heard his name, my heart ached. Like an old wound tearing open. Like something I had tried to forget but never could. And deep inside me where memories of another life whispered. I knew this was not our first meeting. The hall was filled with voices. My mother, weeping with joy. My sisters, whispering in awe. My father, already making arrangements. But I stood there, frozen. Because something was wrong. Something didn't make sense. Why me? Why would the emperor decree that I, a noblewoman of no particular importance, should marry the most powerful man in the empire? There were countless noble daughters more beautiful, more influential, more eager for such a match. And yet, he had chosen me. I clenched my hands. No one questioned an imperial decree. I had no choice. But neither, it seemed, did he. The engagement was swift. Within days, I was summoned to the palace to meet him. The palace was colder than I expected. The walls loomed tall, and the air was thick with the scent of ink and incense. I sat in a grand hall, waiting for my betrothed to arrive. Waiting to meet the man whose name made my soul tremble. Then the doors opened. And he stepped inside. I forgot how to breathe. Tall. Clad in dark armor. A man carved by war. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart. Gold. Just like in my dreams. Just like his. 1,000 memories flashed through me. A battlefield. A promise under the moon. A sword through my chest. His face was the same as it was now, whispering my name in agony. I gripped the arms of my chair. It couldn't be. Renjian was dead. And I was by Shui now. He stopped before me, silent. For a moment, I swore I saw something flicker in his gaze. Recognition. Shock. Pain. But it was gone in an instant. He bowed stiffly. Lady Bai. His voice was deep, unreadable. I swallowed the lump in my throat. General Li. Silence stretched between us. I could feel the weight of my family's eyes on me, waiting for me to speak, to act like a proper, blushing bride-to-be. But my mind was spinning. This feeling, this strange, aching familiarity. Did he feel it too? He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me drowning in a past I could not remember. The engagement was official. In 30 days, I would be married. Bound to a man who felt like a ghost from another life. Bound to a man whose golden eyes haunted my dreams. But one question consumed me. Did he know? Did General Li Weiran remember a life where he had once been Renjian? The palace was alive with preparations. Silk merchants flooded our estate, measuring me for robes finer than I had ever worn. Servants whispered about the grand wedding, about how lucky I was to be marrying the empire's greatest general. But luck had nothing to do with it. I had met my betrothed only once, and in that brief encounter, General Li Weiran had barely looked at me. He did not speak more than the required pleasantries. He did not smile. And when our gazes met, even for a fleeting second, there was nothing, no warmth, no curiosity, not even the polite interest one might offer a stranger. It was as if he had already decided that I was irrelevant. Perhaps I was. After all, why would the Empire's war hero care for the delicate flower forced upon him? The whispers began before I even stepped foot into his household. She is unworthy of him, I overheard a lady-in-waiting murmur. A fragile noblewoman. What use will she be to a man of war? She won't last the first winter in his northern fortress. They spoke as if I wasn't there, as if I wasn't listening. I should have ignored them. I had always been good at pretending I didn't care. And yet, something deep inside me, something older than Bai Shui, stirred with quiet rage. Unworthy. In another life, I led armies. I held swords heavier than these silk robes. I carved my own fate. And now, they whispered as if I were nothing. I clenched my fists beneath the table, my nails pressing into my palms. I should have dismissed it. But the worst part wasn't their gossip. The worst part was that Li Weiran did nothing to silence them. He did not defend me. He did not acknowledge me. It was as if he, too, believed I was insignificant. The second time we met, it was to discuss wedding arrangements. We sat across from each other in a pavilion, the soft sound of water trickling from a jade fountain. Servants bustled around us, setting tea on the table, arranging delicate snacks on gold-rimmed plates. Li Weiran sat stiffly, his posture perfect, his face expressionless. "Do you have any requests for the ceremony?" I asked, my voice even. He barely spared me a glance. "Whatever pleases you." I waited. That was all. Not even the courtesy of pretending to care. I watched him, searching his face for some sign of discomfort, disinterest in anything. But his golden eyes were empty, his expression carved from stone. It was unsettling. It was wrong. Because deep inside me, something whispered, this is not who you were. Once, those eyes burned with fire. Once, they softened when they looked at me. And now, they were cold. I pressed my lips together. "Then I request that my family's banners be included in the procession," I said, watching him carefully. "As a show of unity." He lifted his teacup, as if my words meant nothing. "As you wish." And just like that, our conversation was over. The night before our wedding, I couldn't sleep. I tossed in my silk-covered bed, my mind restless, my body uneasy. And then, the dream came. Or rather, the memory. I stood in a palace of ice and shadows. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of something burning. I turned and saw him. Not Li Weiran, but a man who looked like him. A man with golden eyes and fire at his fingertips. His armor was covered in blood. Not his own. Mine. And in the memory, I whispered one word before darkness swallowed me whole. Rengen. I woke with a sharp gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was silent, the lanterns casting flickering gold light across the silk curtains. But my body was shaking, because I had never known a man named Rengen. And yet, I could still feel the weight of his sword piercing my chest. I could still hear his voice, saying my name like it was the last thing keeping him alive. A name that should have been mine. Lucian. I pressed my hand to my chest. The skin was smooth, unscarred. But I could still feel the pain. Still feel him. And somewhere in this palace, my betrothed, the man who did not care for me, the man who acted like we had never met, was the very same man who had killed me once before. The first time I met Lady Myrone, she was standing by Li Weiran's side, her gaze assessing me with the careful sharpness of a blade. She was beautiful, in a way that demanded admiration. Dark, silken hair pinned with delicate jade ornaments, a figure draped in embroidered robes that whispered of nobility and confidence. But it wasn't her beauty that unsettled me. It was the way she looked at me as if I were an insect that had landed on her silk sleeve, something unwelcome, something she could flick away with a mere breath. She did not bow when I entered. She did not even smile. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and murmured, "So this is the woman our great general is to marry. Not Lady Bai Shui. Not the daughter of the prestigious Bai family. Just this woman." And that was when I knew she despised me. The palace had always been a place of whispers, of schemes woven beneath silken veils. And Myrone. She was no different. The day after our formal betrothal, rumors began to spread. Lady Bai Shui is delicate and sickly. She has no talent in the arts, no charm to please a husband. The general deserves someone stronger, someone who understands him. Someone like Lady Myrone. The words slithered through the palace halls, slipping into the ears of noblewomen, of court officials, of servants who carried gossip like precious jewels. I did not need to ask who started them. But I remained silent. Because a woman who acts in haste is a woman who loses. And I did not intend to lose. The court banquet was my first test. It was meant to be a formal affair, a celebration of the Empire's latest military victory. I had barely stepped into the hall when I felt eyes on me. Lady Myrone sat beside the Empress Dowager, dressed in flawless golden silk, her every movement graceful, practiced, perfect. And beside her, Li Weiran. He did not look at me when I entered. But Myrone did. And then, she smiled. It was the soft, delicate smile of a woman who knew she had already won. I clenched my hands beneath my sleeves. The game had begun. The first course was served lotus soup, delicately flavored, a dish meant to symbolize purity. The Empress Dowager lifted her spoon, then paused. She frowned. "This is unbearably bitter," she said, setting it down. The murmurs began immediately. The banquet was arranged by Lady Bai Shui, was it not? Yes, she was in charge of the menu. What an insult, to serve something so unpleasant to Her Majesty. I did not need to turn to know who had planted that seed. Myrone sat in perfect stillness, her lips curved slightly, as if this had nothing to do with her. But I knew better. The soup had been changed. And if I acted recklessly, if I flinched, if I stammered, if I let even a flicker of hesitation cross my face, I would be exactly what she wanted me to be. A fragile, incompetent woman. I refused. I lifted my own spoon, tasting the soup as if I had expected nothing else. Then, I smiled. "Your Majesty," I said smoothly, "this soup was meant to complement the wine that follows. The bitterness enhances the sweetness, creating harmony between flavors." A lie. A gamble. But I watched as the Empress Dowager hesitated, lifting the wine cup to her lips. A sip. And then, a nod of approval. "How unexpected," she murmured. "But, it does pair well." The whispers shifted. And Lady Myrone for the first time that evening faltered. The second trap came the following week. The palace gardens were filled with noblewomen, gathered to observe a poetry recital. A servant approached me with a sealed letter. A request. The Empress Dowager wished for me to perform a test. A humiliation. Because everyone knew I was not a poet. But Lady Myrone was. And when I glanced across the courtyard, I saw her standing with the other women, her hands folded gracefully, her lips curved in amusement. I could see it in her eyes. You will fail. But I did not write poetry in this life. I had written command scrolls, battle orders, war strategies. And so, that is what I gave them. I stepped forward, my voice steady as I recited. The night is dark, the winds are cruel. The battlefield knows neither mercy nor regret. But we are blades, tempered by fire. We are storms, fierce and unyielding. And though the world may turn against us, we do not break. Silence. Then, applause. Not the polite claps of duty-bound nobles, but true applause. The Empress Dowager looked intrigued. You speak as a warrior. I bowed. Perhaps because my heart remembers war. And across the courtyard, Myrone's smile was gone. Despite all her efforts, despite the rumors, despite the traps, the Emperor remained adamant. The decree was final. The marriage would happen. I watched as Lady Myrone stood outside the palace halls, her hands trembling in the sleeves of her robes. She turned to me, her voice sharp with barely concealed anger. Do you even know what kind of man Li Weiran is? She hissed. Do you think he will ever love you? I tilted my head, studying her. And then, I smiled. I do not need his love, I said. I only need to survive. Because the truth was, love had already killed me once before. The wedding was grand. Lanterns hung high above the palace gates, casting a golden glow on the lavish red silk draping the hallways. The scent of incense and jasmine filled the air, and the sound of ceremonial drums echoed through the vast courtyard. I sat beside General Li Weiran, dressed in layers of crimson, my face hidden beneath an intricate veil. The entire court had gathered to witness the union. The Emperor's decree had made it unbreakable, binding us in name, if not in heart. But even as we performed the sacred rituals, I felt it. The distance. He never touched me, never glanced at me with the curiosity or interest one might have for a newly wedded wife. His voice remained impassive as he recited his vows, and when he lifted the cup of wine to seal the marriage, he merely tilted his head in acknowledgement, drinking without a word. I followed suit, my fingers tightening around the porcelain cup. This was not a wedding. This was a duty. And I was merely a piece of it. Tradition dictated that after the wedding banquet, the groom would escort his bride to their new chambers. But Li Weiran never did. Instead, it was the servants who led me away. I was taken not to the main courtyard, not to the chambers of the general's wife, but to a smaller, more secluded courtyard at the far end of the manor. A side courtyard. For concubines. For unimportant wives. For women who were merely there to serve a purpose. I stood in the doorway, staring at the modest room before me. The silk bedding was simple, the furniture unembellished. There were no red wedding candles, no lingering traces of his presence, nothing to indicate that a bride had just entered her husband's home. I turned to the servants. Why have I been brought here? I asked. The head maid, an elderly woman with a carefully neutral expression, bowed deeply. The general has arranged for you to stay in this courtyard, my lady, she said. If you require anything, we will ensure it is brought to you. I was silent for a long moment. Then, I stepped inside, my fingers tracing the cool wooden frame of the door. So this was how it would be. That night, sleep evaded me. Not because of sorrow or disappointment, those emotions had no place in a heart that had been betrayed once before. But because I could hear them. The whispers. The hushed conversations of servants, passing outside my room. She must be foolish to think the general would care for her. The general only married her because of the emperor's decree. He doesn't even want her in the main courtyard. And why would he? Lady Myrone has been by his side for years. Everyone knows it should have been her. The words slid through the thin walls like poison-tipped needles. But it was one voice, low, steady, familiar, that made my fingers clench against the silk sheets. Commander Ju. His most trusted aide. His lordship did what was necessary, Jew's voice murmured, just outside. But his heart is not in it. She is just a political pawn. Just a pawn. I closed my eyes, my breath steady, controlled. I should not have cared. This marriage had never been for love. I had entered it knowing that Li Wei-Ran was not a man who would welcome me with open arms. And yet, a strange, unwanted weight settled in my chest. I was not a pawn. Not in this life. Not ever again. The next morning, I rose before dawn. Servants arrived, expecting to see a fragile bride nursing her wounded pride. Instead, they found me fully dressed, standing in the middle of the courtyard, practicing sword forms with precise, fluid movements. The maids exchanged uneasy glances. It was not proper for a noble lady to train in such a way, especially not a newly wedded bride who had just been shunned by her husband. But I did not care. I would not break. I would not fade into the background like a forgotten shadow. If Li Wei-Ran thought I was insignificant, if he believed I was merely a pawn in this political game, then he would soon realize. He had married something far more dangerous than a pawn. He had married a queen. A week passed. A week of silence from Li Wei-Ran. A week of whispers that slithered through the grand halls of the general's manor, through the palace, through the court. It was no secret that the general had left his new wife in a side courtyard, treating her as if she were an afterthought. I had expected it. But that did not mean I would accept it. If he believed I would simply fade into the background, then he did not know the woman he had married. Not in this life. Not in the one before. It was during one of my morning walks in the general's private study place I had not been invited to but entered anyway that I found it. A scroll. Tucked away between ledgers and military reports, sealed with an insignia I did not recognize. At first, I thought nothing of it. But as I unraveled the parchment, my breath caught in my throat. The words before me were not simple documents of war. They were records. Of me. Of my name. Not Bai Shui. Not the noble daughter of this lifetime. But a name that should have been long buried. Liu Xian. The Moon Empress. My past life. I could not breathe. The inked words were detailed, precise, recounting a prophecy lost to time, one that spoke of two souls bound by war and fate, destined to meet across lifetimes. And Li Wei-Ran. His name was there too. I tightened my grip on the parchment, my heart pounding. This decree, this marriage, it was never random. We were bound together long before this life. That night, when Li Wei-Ran finally returned to the manor, I was waiting. He did not seem surprised to see me in his main hall, seated as if I belonged there, though I had never once been invited. What do you think you're doing? His voice was cool, distant, unreadable. I placed the scroll on the table between us. Explain this. His gaze flickered to the parchment, but his face remained impassive. Where did you get that? Does it matter? He exhaled slowly, stepping forward, towering over me. It is nothing but superstition, he said. A superstition you chose to hide. My voice was steady, but inside, my blood boiled. You knew, didn't you? About us. About the past. His jaw tightened. I do not believe in fate. I studied him, the man who was once my greatest love and my greatest betrayer. The fire in his eyes had not changed. And yet, something was different. I could not place it. But I would. I would uncover every secret he was hiding. And I would not allow him to cast me aside so easily. But I was not the only one who refused to accept my place. Lady Myrone. She had been watching. Waiting. The childhood friend of the general. The woman everyone expected to be his wife. The one who had not taken my presence lightly. The one who set a trap before I even realized I had stepped into it. It happened the following evening. I had just returned to my courtyard when the sound of rushed footsteps and gasping breaths broke through the quiet. A maid, one of the newer ones assigned to me, stumbled forward, her face pale. My lady, your honor, please. Come quickly. The master is. The urgency in her voice sent my heart pounding. What is it? I demanded. But she did not explain. She only led me through the twisting corridors of the estate, until we reached a secluded pavilion deep within the gardens. And that was when I saw him. A man. Drunk, barely conscious, collapsed onto the silk cushions of a secluded chamber. His robes were disheveled, the scent of wine thick in the air. And just as I turned in confusion, the doors burst open. Servants. Guards. And at the center of them all, Lady Myrone. Her lips curled into a perfect expression of shock, her hands clutching delicately at her chest. "My lady," she gasped, loud enough for all to hear. "How could you?" And at that moment, I understood. A trap. A scandal designed to ruin me, to paint me as an unfaithful wife, to give the general the perfect reason to cast me aside. I clenched my fists, my mind racing. I had been a fool. I should have expected this. I should have known that the women of the court did not fight with swords. They fought with rumors, with deception, with carefully crafted disgrace. But if Lady Myrone thought I would crumble so easily, she was gravely mistaken. Lady Myrone must have thought I would break. That in the face of public disgrace, I would lower my head, let shame swallow me whole, and quietly fade from Li Weiran's life. She had miscalculated. Because the moment her voice rang out, accusing and triumphant, I lifted my chin, squared my shoulders, and smiled. "Lady Myrone," I said, my voice smooth, unwavering. "What a surprise to see you here, leading such a grand spectacle." She faltered. The watching servants and guards hesitated. I could feel their anticipation, their hunger for scandal. But they were not the only ones watching. From the shadows beyond the open doors, Li Weiran stood, silent, unmoved, observing, waiting. I stepped forward, toward the unconscious man sprawled on the cushions. A stranger, his identity as much a mystery to me as this so-called evidence against me. I gestured lazily at him. "Tell me, Lady Myrone, does this man belong to you?" Her lips parted. What? "Well, it seems he does not belong to me," I continued. "After all, I did not bring him here. I do not even know his name. Yet you arrived so quickly, so confidently, almost as if you already knew where to find him. How strange." The murmurs began. A shift in the air. Doubt. Myrone's expression flickered. "Why you?" Or perhaps, I mused, tilting my head, someone else lured me here. Perhaps someone thought that the easiest way to slander me was to place an unfamiliar man at my feet and hope that appearances alone would be enough to ruin me. Myrone's face twisted. "How dare you?" "I dare because I have nothing to hide." My voice cut through hers, sharp as a blade. "Can you say the same?" She flinched. And in that moment, I knew. I had turned her trap against her. A scandal is only powerful if the accused cowers before it. But I had lived as an empress once. I had faced betrayal. I had died drenched in my own blood. This was nothing. Later that night, I waited. For Li Weiran to summon me. To question me. To punish Myrone. But no summons came. No consequences followed. Nothing. It was as if the entire event had never happened. And that, more than anything, made my blood burn. I had proven my innocence. I had survived humiliation. Yet the man who had the power to put an end to these petty schemes did nothing. Why? Did he not care? Or was there another reason he chose to remain silent? I needed to find out. It was the third night after the scandal. I had just dismissed my attendants and was preparing to rest when I felt it. The presence. Cold. Calculated. I did not hesitate. The moment I turned, I flung the candle beside me. The flames illuminated the figure only for a second as a masked assassin. And then, they lunged. I barely dodged the first strike. The dagger's edge grazed my arm, burning hot against my skin. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed the nearest porcelain vase and hurled it. It shattered against the assassin's shoulder, sending them stumbling back. A second dagger flew toward me. I twisted, but this time, pain. A deep, slicing pain along my side. I gasped, gripping the wound. The assassin's eyes gleamed from behind the mask. They thought I was weak. They thought I would fall easily. Fools. I pressed my hand to my wound, steadied my breath. And when they lunged again, I moved first. With all the strength I had, I grabbed their wrist, twisting sharply. A pained grunt. The dagger clattered to the ground. I moved to strike. And then, the assassin spoke. A whisper. A name. Not by Shwe. Not the name I carried in this life. But Lucian. My blood turned to ice. The assassin wrenched free, staggering back, as if realizing their mistake. For a split second, they hesitated. And in that hesitation, the doors burst open. Li Wei-Iran, sword in hand. His expression was unreadable, but his stance was not. He was ready to kill. The assassin cursed, darted for the window, and was gone, leaving behind only the echo of my past name in the air. I did not remember collapsing. But when I woke, the air smelled of medicine. I was in the general's quarters. The wound on my side had been bandaged, the pain dull but present. And standing beside me, Li Wei-Iran. His gaze was unreadable as he spoke. The assassin was not after you, he said. I almost laughed. They called me by another name, I whispered. Lucian. His hands tightened at his sides. He did not react in shock. Not in confusion. As if he already knew. I struggled to sit up. Tell me the truth, General. He met my gaze. And then, the world blurred. Pain flared in my skull. A rush of images. Too fast, too overwhelming. A blood-red moon. A sword through my heart. Rengen. I gasped, clutching my head. And just like that, the memories disappeared. As if they had never been there. Li Wei-Iran's voice broke through the haze. Rest, by Shwe. It was an order. But behind it, something else. Something I could not name. Or maybe, something I was not meant to remember yet. The world did not feel quite real after that night. The wound on my side had begun to heal, but the greater wound, the one in my mind, bled endlessly. I was Lucian. The assassin had called me that name. A name I had never spoken in this lifetime. And yet, when I whispered it to myself in the quiet solitude of my chamber, it felt like a forgotten melody returning to my lips. But what did it mean? Who was I before? And why? Why did I feel as if Li Wei-Iran knew something about it? He had not reacted with surprise when I told him about the assassin's words. That haunted me more than the attack itself. I needed answers. And fate, ever cruel, decided to give me one. In the most unexpected way. I had taken to wandering the manor at night. Something inside me would not let me sleep, as if my body knew there was something I had yet to find. And so, I walked. Through the empty halls, past the cold moonlit courtyards, deeper and deeper into places I had not yet explored. That was when I found it. A door. Old. Heavy. Forgotten. It should have been locked. It wasn't. The air inside smelled of dust and time. The faint scent of oil and rust. A storage vault. Weapons, armor, relics of past wars, things that should have remained buried. My fingers brushed along the surface of an old chest, its wooden edges rough with age. Something compelled me to open it. And there, beneath layers of silk and parchment, lay a sword. My breath caught. I knew this sword. But that was impossible. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The moment my fingers curled around the hilt. A rush of air. A flood of memories. The world tilted, spun, shattered. And suddenly, I was no longer by Shwe. I was Lucian. And I was dying. The memories came in fragments, like broken glass catching the light. I saw myself, dressed in crimson armor, sword in hand, fighting against the tide of an enemy army. I saw Renjian, his face, his eyes, the way he looked at me as if I were the only thing in the world that mattered. I saw fire. Betrayal. A red moon, heavy in the sky. Renjian standing before me, sword dripping with my blood. I felt the steel pierce my chest all over again. Felt the air leave my lungs as I collapsed. Felt the unbearable ache of his voice calling my name, though I could not make out his words before the darkness swallowed me whole. The pain was real. The grief, the loss real. I gasped, stumbling back, the sword clattering to the ground. The vision was gone. But the memory, it was mine. I know now. I was not just Bai Shui. I was Luxian. And I had once loved a man named Renjian. A man who had killed me. I did not think so. I acted. The moment my breath steadied, the moment my limbs stopped trembling, I ran. Straight to Li Weiran's quarters. Straight to the man whose face haunted me in a way I could not yet understand. The guards tried to stop me, but there was something in my eyes that made them hesitate. I shoved the doors open. He was awake. Standing by the window, dressed in nothing but his inner robes, bathed in the glow of the moonlight. His sword lay on the table beside him. As if he, too, had been unable to rest. His gaze met mine, sharp as ever. Bai Shui. His voice was calm, unreadable. What are you doing here? I stepped forward, my heart hammering. Who are you? A flicker of something in his eyes. I pressed on. Who are you, truly? And what do you know about me? His fingers curled at his sides. You are Bai Shui. No, my voice shook. I was someone else before. I was Luxian. Silence. The kind that stretched, deep and suffocating. Then, Li Weiran let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable, and said something that shattered me further. You finally remembered. The world seemed to shift, the walls pressing in, the air suddenly too thin. You knew. I whispered. He did not deny it. Instead, he turned away slightly, his jaw tightening. Then softly, almost reluctantly. I have been having dreams. I stilled. Dreams. He exhaled. They started years ago. Visions of war, of an empire on the brink of ruin. And a woman. His voice dropped lower. A woman I could never forget, though I did not know her name. My throat went dry. He looked at me then, something heavy in his gaze. But tonight, when I saw you holding that sword, it was as if everything became clear. I struggled to breathe. Who was I to you? Li Weiran did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer. So close that I could see the way his fingers trembled at his sides, the way his normally unreadable mask cracked just slightly. I don't know, he admitted. Not yet. A strange, aching silence fell between us. Because I knew who he was. He was Renjian. He was the man who had once sworn to protect me, and the man who had put a sword through my heart. But now, he was Li Weiran. A man who, despite his coldness, had saved me. A man who had been dreaming of me before either of us understood why. It was cruel. It was fate. It was terrifying. I swallowed hard. What happens now? His gaze burned into mine. I don't know, he said again. And that was the most frightening answer of all. Love was a dangerous thing. I had never truly understood that before. Not until him. Not until Li Weiran. He had spent his entire life turning away from it, building walls so high that even the sharpest arrows of affection could never pierce through. I used to think it was because he was cold, that perhaps he had never been capable of love in the first place. But I was wrong. It wasn't that he didn't love. It was that he was terrified to. Terrified that love would destroy him. That it would make him weak. That the moment he reached for it, it would be taken away. And yet, despite all his careful restraint, he was slipping. I could see it in the way his eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking. I could hear it in the hesitation in his voice, the way he held himself back as if afraid that one step closer would break him entirely. I could feel the weight of something unspoken between us, heavy and suffocating. But he wasn't the only one who was afraid. I had started to remember. Our past. The shadows of another life, of another loved one that had been brutally, mercilessly torn apart. And as much as I wanted answers, I wasn't sure if I could face them. Because the truth was beginning to dawn on me. and it was more terrifying than anything else. We had died because we were in love. And now, history is repeating itself. 4 days after our confrontation, Li Weiran avoided me. I wasn't surprised. He was the kind of man who would rather face a battlefield alone than confront his own emotions. I saw him from a distance, his usual rigid posture as he discussed military affairs, the sharp edge of his sword as he trained with his men. But I also saw something else. A man who was haunted. A man who was running from something he could not escape. And that thing was me. But while Li Weiran and I were unraveling our tangled fates, another storm was brewing. A storm named Myrone. She had spent years at his side, watching, waiting, believing that if she was patient enough, devoted enough, she would one day be the only woman he needed. But I had ruined everything. I, the woman she had deemed unworthy, had been placed in the position she had spent years longing for. And she hated me for it. Her hatred was like a slow poison, creeping through her veins, consuming her thoughts. She had tried to shame me, to make me appear weak, to push me into submission. But I had not broken. And now, she was done waiting. If she couldn't control Li Weiran's heart, she would make sure that no one else could have it. She needed an ally. And there was only one man who hated me enough to help her. Duke Lu Jin. A powerful noble with influence in the imperial court. A man who had been working tirelessly to weaken my family's power. And now, he had a reason to get rid of me entirely. A hunting trip, Myrone proposed, her voice a whisper in the candlelit room. She sat across from Duke Lu Jin, her expression deceptively calm. One misplaced arrow. One unfortunate accident, she mused, swirling the wine in her cup. Duke Lu Jin chuckled. And if she survives? She won't. Her smile was cruel. Because she had planned for more than one contingency. That night, a special wine was prepared. A gift for me. One laced with something dangerous. Not enough to kill me. But just enough to make sure that when I stepped into that hunting ground, I would not be able to protect myself. While my enemies plotted, I was digging into the past. I knew now that Li Weiran and I had been connected in another life. But how? And why had we died? I searched through the manor's archives, desperate for answers. And then, I found it. A decree. Old, fragile, hidden beneath stacks of forgotten documents. It detailed the execution of General Rengen and his wife, Luxian, my past self. And at the bottom of the document was a name. A name that made my stomach turn. Duke Lu Jin. It was him. It had always been him. And now, he was trying to kill me again. The next morning, a royal messenger arrived. The emperor had ordered a hunting trip. And I had been invited. Li Weiran read the summons, his brows furrowing. Something felt wrong. You don't have to go, he said. His voice was low, careful. I looked at him. I knew the danger. But I also knew this was my chance. If I did not face my past, I would never escape it. So I smiled. Yes, I murmured. I do. That night, as I prepared for the hunt, a letter arrived. Sealed in red wax. Li Weiran and I opened it together. Inside was a single sentence. The past was only the beginning. If you want the truth, follow the blood moon. No name. No explanation. Just a cryptic message that sent chills down my spine. Li Weiran's fingers tightened around the parchment. His jaw clenched. And when he looked at me, something passed between us. Something silent. Something terrifying. Because we both knew. This was no longer about Myrone's jealousy. No longer about Duke Lu Jin's political schemes. There was another enemy in the shadows. Someone who knew everything. Someone who had been watching. And we were running out of time to find them. Some betrayals arrive like a knife in the dark, swift, cold, and merciless. Others unfold slowly, like a sickness that rots away at the foundations of everything you thought was unshakable. This was the latter. And by the time we realized it, the empire was already teetering on the edge of destruction. It started with whispers in the court. A growing unrest among the noble families. Rumors that the emperor had become weak, that his judgment was failing, that he had allowed himself to be swayed by personal sentiment rather than strategy. It was nothing new. Politics in the capital had always been a treacherous thing. But this time, the rumors weren't just words. They were fuel. Fuel for something much, much larger. The first real sign of danger came when Duke Lu Jin made his move. It was subtle at first, small alliances being formed behind closed doors, loyal military generals quietly being replaced with his men, court officials swearing allegiance to him rather than the emperor. I had been too focused on my wrong schemes to see it at first. Too consumed by my own past, by the unraveling of my memories, to realize that something far more dangerous was taking shape around me. But when I finally understood the scope of what was happening, it was already too late. Because I was the bait. I just hadn't realized it yet. The royal hunting trip was meant to be a test. I knew it the moment I stepped into the dense, sun-dappled forest, my senses on high alert. Everything was too controlled. Too perfect. The paths too conveniently cleared, the game too conveniently placed, the people around me watching too closely. And then, the trap was sprung. One moment, I was riding through the trees, my bow drawn, my pulse steady. The next, the ground beneath me exploded, a hidden snare sending my horse rearing, sending me plummeting into the darkness below. Pain lanced through me as I hit the ground, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. Branches cracked. Hooves thundered. Voices shouted above, Li Weiran's voice among them. I tried to move. But before I could, a figure emerged from the shadows. A face I never expected to see again. It's been a long time, Bai Shui. My blood turned to ice. I knew this man. Not from this life. But from the one before it. He had been there the night I died. The night we died. Li Weiran and I, our last breath stolen, our bodies left to the mercy of history. And now, he stood before me again. Alive. Unaged. As if time itself had bowed to his will. Impossible. I struggled to sit up, my limbs trembling, my vision blurring at the edges. My mind raced. How? How could he be here? How could he remember? Unless. A terrifying thought struck me. Had he always known? Had he always been watching, waiting, pulling the strings while I fumbled in the dark for answers? A slow smile spread across his face as if he could hear my thoughts. Did you think you were the only ones? I didn't have time to react before something cold pressed against my neck. Darkness swallowed me whole. I woke to the sound of steel meeting steel. Distant at first like echoes in a dream. Then louder. Sharper. A battlefield. I forced my eyes open, my body sluggish, my mind fighting through the haze of whatever drug they had used on me. My wrists were bound. I was in a tent. A war tent. And outside. Li Weiran. Fighting. I could hear him. The way his blade cut through the air, the way his movements were controlled, lethal. I could hear the desperation in it. Because he was fighting for me. And he was losing. Not in skill. But in numbers. Duke Lu Jin had an army. And the emperor had no idea. This was not just about me anymore. This was a coup. They had used me to lure him away from the capital, away from his soldiers, away from his emperor. To weaken him. To break him. And when he finally reached me, when our eyes met through the chaos, I knew. I knew the choice he was about to make. I shook my head, my throat raw, my voice hoarse. No. He was going to surrender. For me. They bound him in chains. They forced him to his knees before Duke Lu Jin. And I watched, helpless, as the man I loved, the man who had defied fate itself, was told to choose. Your duty, the Duke sneered, or her life. Because that was the final blow. The one thing they knew would shatter him completely. He could betray the Emperor, kneel before a usurper, throw away his honor, and live. Or he could watch me die. A cold weight settled in my chest. I knew what he would do. Even before he spoke. Even before he lowered his head, his voice quiet, steady. I will not betray my emperor. The words cut through me like a blade. I screamed his name. I fought against my restraints, against the hands that held me back. But the decision had been made. The order had been given. The executioner stepped forward. And I knew I was about to lose him all over again. Then a horn sounded in the distance. The ground shook. Shouts rose from the outer camps. Something was coming. No. Someone. A rider. Racing toward us through the dust and chaos. Dressed in royal gold. The imperial seal glinted against his chest. He reined in his horse with a brutal pull, his voice booming through the valley. By order of the emperor, stop this at once. Silence fell. The duke's face twisted in fury. But it was too late. The emperor had learned of the betrayal. And the tide had turned. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Li Weiran was still alive. But I knew this was far from over. Because as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep, foreboding red. And for the second time that day, a message arrived. Delivered by a nameless rider. Sealed in red wax. I opened it with shaking hands. And inside, a single sentence. The past was only the beginning. If you want the truth, follow the blood moon. No name. No explanation. Just a message that sent ice through my veins. Because whoever this enemy was, they were not done with us yet. Fate was not something that could be escaped. Not when it had followed us through lifetimes. Not when it had killed us before. But this time we would fight it. We would tear apart the cycle that had shackled us to pain, to betrayal, to loss. And we would win. The Imperial army stormed the valley at dawn. They descended like a tidal wave, their golden banners catching the morning light, their war drums shaking the very earth beneath us. Duke Lu Jin's forces were waiting. Swords drawn. Spears braced. And standing at the center of it all, bound in chains, was Li Weiran. His face was calm, but I saw the flicker of something deep in his eyes as he watched the soldiers close in. Hope. No. Resolve. Because he knew what was coming. What we were about to face. What we had always faced. And this time, he wasn't going to let fate win. Something shifted inside me as I watched him. Like a door unlocking, like a thread pulling taut. And suddenly, I remembered everything. Not just the echoes of the past. Not just the fragments of another life. But everything. I remembered the sorcerer. The one who had cursed us, who had bound our souls in an endless loop of tragedy. A shadow in the dark. A man with no true name. But I knew him now. I had always known him. Because he was here. Because he had never left. And as the battle began. As the first blades clashed. As the war horns rang out across the mountains. I finally saw him. Standing at the edge of the battlefield. Untouched by the chaos. Watching with eyes as dark as the abyss itself. Lin Zhuan. A name long buried. A ghost from a past that refused to die. The sorcerer who had bound us to this fate. The one who had stolen our lives again and again. And he was smiling. Lin Zhuan had been a scholar once. A man of great talent, great power. A man who had once served the imperial court until his ambition grew too vast, until he sought the forbidden arts, until he dared to challenge the emperor himself. And so, he had been punished, exiled, hunted, burned from history. But men like him did not die so easily. Instead, he had vanished into the shadows. And in his hatred, he had crafted a curse. Not just on the imperial family. Not just on the kingdom. But on us. On me. On Li Weiran. On our love. We had been the ones who defied him once. We had been the ones who stood against him. And for that, he had doomed us. Condemned us to find each other in every lifetime only to be torn apart before we could ever truly be together. Every life. Every death. All his doing. And now, as I stared into his cold, knowing eyes, realization struck me with the force of a blade. This was his final move. This was the last act of the cycle. Either we would break it here, or we would die again. And then, amidst the chaos, the emperor arrived. He was not a man who often left his palace. Not a man who descended into the filth of war. And yet, here he was. Clad in imperial gold, his presence commanding, his gaze sharp as it swept over the battlefield. And when he spoke, It was not to condemn the rebels, not to issue decrees of war, but to look directly at us, at me, at Li Wei-Iran, and say, "I have been waiting for this moment." A hush fell over the battlefield. Even Lin Juanthi man who had spent centuries weaving this curse froze at his words, because he had not expected this. None of us had. But the Emperor did not stop. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. "Do you think I did not know?" he said. "Do you think I did not see?" His eyes locked onto mine. "Fate has played its games for too long," he murmured. "It is time to end it." And with those words, the imperial seal in his hand glowed. Lin Juan moved first. He had always been fast, always been ruthless. But this time, so were we. Li Wei-Iran broke his chains. He tore through the battlefield like a storm, his blade flashing, his strength unmatched. He cut down the guards that stood in his way, fought his way to me. And when our hands met, the world shifted. The memories, the pain, the love, the death, all of it flooded between us. I gasped. He shuddered. And in that instant, we knew. This was the moment. This was where it ended. We turned as one. Faced the sorcerer who had stolen lifetimes from us. And as Lin Juan raised his hand, as dark energy crackled at his fingertips, the Emperor spoke the final command. Break. Light erupted from the imperial seal. A force like thunder tore through the battlefield. The curse, the endless, unbreakable cycle shattered. And Lin Juan, for the first time in centuries, screamed. When the dust settled, the war was over. The rebels had fallen. Lin Juan was gone. And the cycle that had bound us had finally been destroyed. But the court was waiting. The nobles. The ministers. The laws of the empire that had always been unyielding. They expected Li Wei-Iran to kneel before them. To take his place as the emperor's most loyal general. To obey. But instead, he turned to me. And for the first time in every lifetime we had lived, he chose. "I will not live under the chains of fate," he said, his voice unwavering. His gaze met mine. And he held out his hand. "Come with me." The court gasped. The emperor watched. The world waited. And I did not hesitate. I took his hand. And together, we walked away. Away from duty. Away from fate. Toward a life of our own making. For the first time in forever, we were finally free.